So, if you haven't heard about it, Wizards of the Coast is preparing itself for releasing their new iteration of the Player's Handbook, what will effectively be something like a 5.5e. And they're seeking to fix some issues that the original Player's Handbook had, add some new content, take some content out, and just in general, I guess update the whole thing. Now, they are seeking help in this matter. They have released a playtest PDF of stuff that they're seeking to test, stuff that might make it into the new Player's Handbook. And they're asking us, the community, to give them some feedback on it to see what we think. Now, if you haven't seen this, I will have a link in the description below. Now, some of the things on this playtest I feel are really good, and some of it really, really bad. Now, the reality is that Wizards of the Coast is a business, and they have to sell books. They have to make changes so that you feel like you have to buy the book, otherwise, why would you? Though to be fair, that is a fairly pessimistic outlook to it. Changes are indeed needed in a lot of places, and some of the stuff that they're working through are really, really good. But it is up to us to figure out what is a good change and what is not a good change. Now, the topic of today's video and what I really wanted to talk about are racial stats. You know them, these are the stats that you get when you pick a Dungeons & Dragons race. For example, when you pick a Tiefling, you get a +1 to Intelligence and a +2 to Charisma. Or when you pick a Dwarf, you can get a +2 to Constitution and a +1 to either Wisdom or Strength, depending on the subrace you choose. Now, this is the topic today because Wizards of the Coast is playtesting moving these stats over to backgrounds, rather than having them be tied to races. So being a dwarf wouldn't give you any stats anymore. Instead, you would basically just be able to pick whatever stats you want, regardless of whatever race you are. So do you want to be a dwarf with a +2 to Intelligence? You got it. What about a +2 to Charisma? You could do that. You would essentially just be able to pick them freely. Now, this change intrigues me, and it is one of the changes that they're thinking of making, which I happen to think is a very bad change. Now, I have been having a fair amount of conversations with people about it, some people being in favor, some being against it, and what I have found out is that generally speaking, if you're in favor of a change such as this, it is either one, because having stats be tied to race makes you feel limited in your class options, or two, you do not like the bought-in collective fantasy of Dungeons & Dragons. And I do want to talk about these two things on this video because I do think that there is an issue that needs to be solved, but I think that we're going about it completely the wrong way. First, I do want to talk about the collective fantasy of Dungeons & Dragons. What is that? What does that mean? Well, here, let me set for you a stage. Let's say that our player's name is Brian, and he's new to Dungeons & Dragons. He's not really sure what to play, he just knows that he wants to be some kind of axe-wielding badass. Between the fighter and the barbarian, the fighter seems better to Brian, so he goes with that. He starts looking at which races to play, and he falls in love at first sight with the Goliath. There's just something special about an 8-foot-tall, 330-pound beast of a man that cleaves enemies in half with an axe. To him, it sounds epic. So he goes and plays D&D like normal as a Goliath fighter. He reads up on the entry about the Goliaths, about how they live up in the mountains, how they struggle for survival up there, that they have clans, they compete with each other, they are unbelievably strong, all that good stuff. And so he goes and writes his backstory to fit all that. Maybe Brian doesn't even read the entry, but instead is explained what Goliaths are by his game master. It doesn't matter. In any case, he decides that his character was born in a clan, but he wanted to see the real world out there, and so he left and became an adventurer. Alright? Well, easy enough. Brian has friends in real life. Friends who play D&D. Maybe he talks to his friend Steve about the Goliath fighter he's playing, and turns out, hey, look, Steve played a Goliath as well before. A barbarian Goliath. Brian and Steve then talk about their characters, about their backstories, about how their game went. Cool. Eventually, Brian plays on a different campaign with a new character. Say he plays Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden. In that adventure, you can actually find Goliaths. Brian interacts with the Goliaths in that adventure. Brian knows what Goliaths are because he played one in the last adventure. He more or less knows what they are like and how strong they are because he remembers. When Brian's character had the option of betting between who would win in an arm wrestling contest between the Goliath and the human, Brian remembered how powerful Goliaths were. Something that would make sense for Brian's character to know in Icewind Dale, since people in there know what Goliaths are in the world, and so he bets on the Goliath, and the Goliath wins. This is an example of the collective fantasy of Dungeons & Dragons. The first game that Brian played had Goliaths. Those Goliaths were similar to the one in the world where his friend Steve played in, and those Goliaths were also similar to the ones Brian interacted with on his second game. If Brian were to play a D&D video game like say Baldur's Gate 3, and there were Goliaths in that game, Brian would know about them. If Brian is reading a D&D novel and they mention Goliaths in passing, Brian would know what the author was talking about. When I say the word Goliath to Brian, there would be an image in his head that forms that would be similar to the image that I myself have in my brain when I utter the word Goliath. When Brian chose his character, he was guided towards picking either a fighter, a barbarian, or perhaps even a paladin. That is because the Goliath race comes with a +2 to strength and a +1 to constitution. Because of those stats, you are decentivized from picking a Goliath wizard or a Goliath druid, since those stats are suboptimal to those classes. So what happened there to Brian happens to everybody. Everyone is incentivized whenever they play a Goliath to be a fighter, a barbarian, or again, perhaps even a paladin. So what happens is, whenever you see a Goliath, whether it is in your table or the next table, chances are that they will be a powerful melee warrior that are very physically imposing. This builds on the collective fantasy of Goliaths because that's what they are meant to be. They are powerful martial warriors. The choices that players are making in choosing these combinations are congruent with the lore and the presentation that the species of Goliath are meant to have within the collective fantasy of Dungeons & Dragons. Halflings, for example, are not meant to be strong. They are a very tiny people known for their quickness. They can be dexterous fighters or rogues relying on speed and accuracy to succeed, but they're not meant to be physically powerful barbarians. A halfling beating a full orc on an arm wrestling contest would be counter-fantasy, provided that there's no magic involved, of course. Now, you can still have that, obviously. All you would have to do is ask your DM if it's okay to play a halfling barbarian, and I am sure that they will let you switch some stats around, provided that they think a powerful halfling works in his world. But the question here now is, what should be the default? Because as it stands now, anyone can be a Goliath wizard if they want to. Really, all they have to do is ask their DM to let them. And so long as it makes sense within the world, I am sure that they will let you. The other option now presented to us in this playtest would be players being able to just choose what stats to pick. So they could just always choose to be Goliath wizards without necessarily asking their DM. Now, generally speaking, you do want to set up rules and then have the DMs have the ability to break them whenever possible, rather than the other way around, where it would be the onus of the DM to make the rules themselves. But the real concern here is what such a change would do to this collective fantasy. The example of Brian and the Goliath is a very simple one. His experience in the game was similar throughout tables, throughout novels and video games, and presumably even through the D&D movie. But you can imagine a scenario in which Brian interacts with orcs, and on one table, orcs are really smart. They can hold conversations normally, they are typical members of society, but then, in the D&D novel, they are monstrous creatures who raid and pillage. Then in the video game, they can't even speak properly, and then in another table they are smart again, then dumb, and then smart. If you play the game Warcraft 3, you will learn how orcs are in that universe. That information that you learn, that knowledge, will help you navigate all the Warcraft novels, the Warcraft movie, and even the game World of Warcraft. Blizzard sells you a collective fantasy, which can be very easily bought in by just interacting with every single one of its products individually. The world is stable across all of their media. Now, you can still have your very own internal homebrew Warcraft world where things are very different, but there is absolutely no confusion as to what the canon world is like in Warcraft. In D&D, we have the player's handbook, which tells you a story, but then you might have a monster manual that might tell you a different story. Then you have the D&D adventure books, which might tell you a whole different story. We need to stop doing this. This is extraordinarily bad for helping players understand the world that D&D is trying to sell them. And thing is, racial stats actually help new players navigate towards this collective fantasy. Now, you might straight up just don't care about either the lore or the collective fantasy. Maybe you don't even care about the movies or the novels, or that the games that we're playing are congruent with those medias. If the player's handbook, for example, says that Goliaths have tons of hair, but the novels say they don't, you may not care one bit. And if that's you, then I completely understand. Because if it really doesn't matter to you whether gnomes should or should not be stronger than Goliaths, or whether orcs are meant or not meant to be dumb, then to you, the only thing at play here is that racial stats limit your ability to pick the class that you want to pick for the race you want to play. And that is 100% understandable, and I completely sympathize. Why shouldn't you be able to play a Goliath caster? Maybe you have tons of really good ideas for how that could work. But the system, as it stands now, prevents you. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to play a character that feels like it is behind the rest of the party. Look, it sucks when your highest stat is 15 rather than 16 or 17, because having a modifier of +2 on your main attack instead just feels bad, man. It does. And that is true. But see, and this is something that, man, I feel like nobody's talking about, but this is actually not a problem with the system. This is not a problem of having stats be tied to the races. This is actually a content problem. Let me explain. There is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't have a class that uses strength as a casting stat, or even better, constitution. It is actually baffling to me that we don't have something like a shaman class, where instead of a druid who gets its magic from nature gods, instead it gets its power from, say, primal spirits. Like perhaps a spirit of strength that would allow a Goliath to full cast using his strength or constitution. Why don't we have a monk subclass that can use strength instead of dexterity as its main stat? Something like a pugilist, where the monk relies on pure power of strength rather than agility to fight, using its ki to punch even harder than normal people. Or a subclass of the rogue that lets you perform sneak attacks using strength. Like imagine a thug subclass of the rogue that maybe gets sneak attack against intimidated foes. I don't know, there's so many options here. There are no reasons why casting needs to be only for intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. Let's look at the Paladin, for example. It is such a greatly designed class. The Paladin is a caster, or well, a half-caster to be precise, and it is actually a casting class that a Goliath could be if they wanted to. The beauty of the Paladin is that it actually does not require charisma for it to function. You could play a Goliath Paladin and have only like 12 charisma and function perfectly well. That is because the class was designed to work to use strength as its primary stat, rather than charisma. Look, the types of spells that the Paladin casts do not rely on charisma at all. Stuff like Bless, Shield of Faith, Elemental Weapon, Fine Steed, all the auras that you can use and all the buffs that you can cast do not require for you to have high charisma at all. And you can always spend a spell slot to smite and increase your damage, and you can do all of that with minimal charisma. So what happens here is that you can indeed be a Goliath Paladin and not feel limited whatsoever by having a +2 to strength and a +1 to constitution as your racial stats. And further, it plays with the collective fantasy of Goliaths being super strong. Now, of course, you do benefit from having a higher charisma as a paladin, but it really doesn't feel bad not having a really high stat on it. And this is why I'm saying this is actually a content problem, not a system problem. It's baffling to me that we have only received one new class since 5th edition came out. It shouldn't be that way. And what this is causing is that players are feeling like they want to innovate, they want to try new things, they want to try out a casting Goliath, which by all means there should be a class option for them to do so, yet there isn't, because for whatever reason, Wizards of the Coast is unable or unwilling to create them, and so instead, Wizards of the Coast is thinking of moving racial stats to backgrounds so that players can just pick whatever stats they want, and so that players can play Wizard Goliaths because they have no other choice that make more sense. You should complain that you want more options, that you want more versatility. I know you want to play a casting half-orc, I know that you want to play a rogue with something other than a human, an elf, or a halfling. I get that, I am 100% with you. You should complain. But you actually solve that with more classes. We also need more subclasses that allow for more versatility in the stats needed for that class to function. We do not need to remove racial stats. Racial stats convey things about the species and about the world that are important in the collective fantasy that we all play in. The argument of, well, just run it like that on your table doesn't help, because it messes with the collective fantasy that we're all trying to build with the system. The goal here should be that when you pick Goliath, you should feel like now you have access to so many cool classes that you otherwise could not pick, instead of feeling like you're restricted from accessing a bunch of other classes that you now can't play. And the way we do that is by adding more classes, by adding more versatility in how subclasses change classes, by adding more races that do more different things. It's frustrating because this is a band-aid that is easy and quick, and at the end of the day doesn't actually solve the real problem of customization on this game, but instead removes a very important component that ties these worlds together. You personally might not care about the collective fantasy that we all inhabit with these games, but you cannot deny that it exists and that it helps new players understand the fantasy world better. The default for the player's handbook should have the integrity and the stability of the fantasy world in mind, with the ability for the dungeon master to change it if he so desires to fit his own world. It doesn't seem logical for the player's handbook to try and subvert the very same fantasy that it is trying to sell you through the adventures, novels, video games, and movies. And the beautiful thing about racial stats is that with such a very small little thing, it actually conveys so much about the world and how these massively different species interact with the world in a manner that lore just can't quite do, which is by letting the player actively experience it. A lesser argument that I have heard in favor of moving racial stats to backgrounds is that what a character does in its life should have a much more powerful impact on its ability to fight in this RPG than the species that it belongs to. So at this point, we're now looking at it as a logistical concept from a meta perspective. If you have it in your backstory that your character has trained every single day of its life, it makes logical sense that you should be able to convey that with stats in your character sheet, and those stats should theoretically make more of an impact than any stats you would get from being a member of a particular species. And that is true. It is undeniable that backstory should be the most important thing. What species you are should matter, of course, but probably not as much as your character's life and experiences. I 100% agree with that. Thing is, we already give stats for backstory, and they are far, far greater than the stats that you get for being of a particular species. The problem is that the player's handbook doesn't really convey that too well. I'm talking about the very first thing that you do in character creation, finding out what your stats are. When you roll for stats, or pick the standard array, or go with the point-buy system, you are literally giving stats to your character dependent on its backstory. Let's say that you pick Goliath for your character, and you write in your backstory that you left your tribe early on and instead went to a human city where you signed up to a college and learned a lot about the world. So your Goliath is a very intelligent Goliath. Well, if you're using the standard array for choosing stats, you are going to put that 15 or 14 or 13 from the standard array options into your intelligence, depending on how intelligent you feel like your Goliath would be. And you're doing that based on which class you're going to play, which is based on your backstory and what your character has been through in its life. You may perhaps write that your Goliath was always very sickly. Well, then put the 8 from your standard array options into your constitution following your backstory. See how that works? So if we grab the baseline for stats for a Dungeons & Dragons character and then see what a standard array gives us, we see this. We see that we get a +5 to any stat of our choice, then we get a +4 to any stat of our choice, then we get a +3 to any stat of our choice, then we get a +2 to any stat of our choice, and then lastly a -2 to any stat of our choice. And all these stats will be allocated completely at will, depending on what your character is, does, and has done. Of course, without overlapping the stats. And looking at this, you're gonna then tell me that having racial stats means that your backstory is now irrelevant? Clearly your backstory gives you so much more stats than what species you pick does. Making racial choice irrelevant by taking away its stats and adding even more to backstory doesn't make any sense when backstory already gives you so much, as you can see. Now, I do want to hear your opinions on this matter. Just please, let's not be toxic about this. There's no reason to fight amongst each other or call each other names or anything like that. I know that some people can be very opinionated about this stuff. I clearly am. If you care about these topics like I do, though, I would highly recommend you head on over to D&D Beyond so that you can participate on the survey that they are doing. This is your one chance at actually being able to influence the direction in which Dungeons & Dragons go with their books. So if I were you, I would go and do the survey and let them know how you feel, whether you agree with me or not. I will try and put a link in the description for it. By the time that I'm recording this, I'm not sure how the survey looks like or what they have in there, but I know that they will release it on the same day that I'm planning on uploading this video, so there you have it. Now, because I know that someone is bound to comment about it, I don't really want to talk too much about the bioessentialism argument on this video. Not to be too dismissive about it, but it just doesn't seem to apply for Dungeons & Dragons, based on the fact that D&D species are miles apart, different from race in the real world. Any comparisons between real-life races and fantasy races just seem kind of goofy to me. Some species on D&D are literally stronger than others, not because they trained to be, but simply because their biology is different to those others. Some D&D species are less intelligent, some can think faster. Humans might be able to do an equation in their head, but beholders might be able to do 10 at the same time. Goliaths, on average, are 7 to 8 feet tall and weigh 330 pounds. Again, on average, whereas the average human is closer to a 5'10" height and weigh about 200 pounds. This is just what it is. And these are just the tamest examples. Some species in D&D have multiple brains, others can fly, others were created by a god to specifically have a certain set of advantages and disadvantages. And you can play as slimes, for God's sake. This is a fantasy world, with entirely different species of creatures living within it, each species completely alien in biology to the next. A lot of people say the greatest mistake D&D ever made was to use the term race to describe all of the different humanoids within the game. You have to think about them as species, even if you don't think the term species is fantasy enough. It just conveys what they actually are. Now, not to say that you can't have a cool fantasy game where all of the fantasy races behave, act, and are biologically similar. Elder Scrolls is a great example of a fantasy world where all of the humanoids are basically the same biology. The orcs on that world are green humans, the elves are just cocky humans, and the Argonians are scaly humans with a funky throat that can breathe underwater. But other than the physical looks and some very small esoteric features, they all are basically humans, and you know what? Those games are freaking fantastic. Some of you may not know, but my channel was Elder Scrolls related for like 6 years. I love that world. But that's not what D&D is. It's not what D&D was built to be. It's not what the story that has been told has ever been. People sometimes complain that the D&D worlds, or most notably the Forgotten Realms, they are confusing and contradictory, and that's what happens when changes are made without thought. Especially when they don't need to be. Now, I do want to clarify something about the collective fantasy of D&D. I know that DMs play their own worlds that may have entirely different fantasies. I'm not expecting, nor should DMs cater to the collective fantasy of D&D. DMs should run what they want to run, and that's just that. What I'm talking about here is about the fact that D&D has a media empire going on right now. Movies, video games, novels, and the tabletop games. The vast majority of this is sort of concentrated on the Forgotten Realms. It just doesn't make any sense to have a player's handbook that would go opposite to what they have in store. It seems foolish to me to sell you one thing with one hand and then promote the opposite on the other. DMs can and should have the ability to do whatever the hell they want with their story. And I understand that Brian is going to play in games that have a completely different fantasy, but it just makes sense to have a cohesive story between the official products. The way that things are now are frankly a confusing nightmare. You know, there is a logical reason why you don't see assault rifles as weapon options in the player's handbook. It's because the fantasy that they're selling with this book is different to that. And the same thing applies with more than just time periods. You simply need cohesiveness with all the books that you're selling. Another thing that I was really saddened to see that they were testing on the playtest has to do with the elimination of half-orcs and half-elves. They literally just deleted half-orcs and half-elves. Instead, they added this system where you can create your own mixed races, which sounds decent in concept, but terrible in practice and absolutely awful for lore consistency. Basically, you pick two ancestor species, then you take the stats from one of them and just pretend to be part of the other. There's no actual mechanics to any of this. You just get the stats from one and just roleplay that you're mixed. It's actually so unbelievably dumb, but whatever. I guess you can always just use the normal player's handbook instead and play half-orcs as normal. But what really gets me is that these are the most popular races in 5th edition and they just deleted them. I don't know how many times D&D Beyond has released their stats, but they did once in 2020, and if I remember correctly, half-elves were the second most popular race in D&D behind humans, and half-orcs were number 5, so that's so weird to me that they would do that. But again, yeah, you can just choose to run them at your table, so what's the harm, right? Well, the harm is that they're adding full-blood orcs instead of half-orcs for you to play, but seemingly not as monstrous races, just like as a normal race. It's hard to tell what direction they would take with this, but again, the problem is consistency here. You have all this media and games and stories and adventures that sort of sell you on this idea that orcs are monstrous creatures that raid and pillage. They're far less intelligent than human races and have the full blood of Grumsh in them to make them rage and destroy things. That's why we play half-orcs. Having half human blood lets them be normal. But if they just have orcs as normal in the player's handbook, we're going to have big conflicts with literally the main setting for Dungeons & Dragons. And look, I am all for playing monstrous creatures. I have a whole PDF lineup here letting people play ogres and succubi and all kinds of monsters. It's not about playing full orcs. You can already do that thanks to Volo's Guide to Monsters. The concern here would be to normalize playing full-blood orcs as if they're human and elves, which they're not. Now again, I'm not sure how they're writing this, but this is a big concern of mine, especially if you remove the fact that orcs are supposed to get a -2 to intelligence, because presumably they would want to remove all racial stats. But if they were to remove that, then it would give people the wrong impression that orcs are something different to what they actually are in the media that D&D itself is selling you. Again, it's just a weird consistency problem here. They have the story that says one thing, and then they would want the player's handbook to just literally just say the opposite. Anyways, please be civil in the comments. I don't typically do videos like this, so please be kind. Now, if you guys want to support me or the channel, then please head on over to my store, mrrex.shop. We got some really cool PDFs in there to make your D&D experience so much better. I can't stop promoting my monster classes because they are by far the best thing that I have done. Play as a dragon man. Enough about being human fighters or Goliath barbarians. Play a copper dragon in your Waterdeep Dragon Heist campaign and have a good time. You will love it because I know that my players certainly are. Now, thank you so much for watching this video. Do not be mean. Again, that's my phone. Do not be mean in the comments, and I'll see you all next time.